Good afternoon. My name is Richard Keeley, and I'm pleased to welcome you to this flagship event of the Winston Center for Leadership and Ethics. When Bob and Judy Winston, who are with us here today, made the founding gift that established the Winston Center in 2006, they envisioned a forum where ideas were shared and sometimes contested, where students in venues large and small would encounter leaders across the spectrum of cultures and institutions, and where the same students would acquire the skills of leadership by careful instruction, practice, and formation. I believe that all of those hopes have been realized, Bob and Judy, and everyone here is in your debt. Today we gather for the 19th time in the Clough Colloquium. The Colloquium is the gift of Chuck and Gloria Clough, whose interest in the life of the mind and the fate of our world has stamped so many efforts on campus. Those 19 gatherings, I can't get over the number, have included historians and writers, mayors, diplomats, men-at-arms, a Nobel Peace Prize winner, scientists, and humanists. Chuck and Gloria, we're grateful for what you have made possible. Here's to number 20. And finally, I am pleased to recognize Mr. Peter McAvin, class of 1984, whose gift in support of the Winston Center this year will allow us to foster many more good conversations on campus. Thank you very much, Peter. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. David Quigley, our Provost and Dean of Faculties, and also a graduate of Amherst College, who will introduce our guest for today. Dr. Quigley.
Let me join the chorus of thanks for all that Bob and Judy Winston have done, as well as Chuck and Gloria Clough over the years, to enable these kinds of events and a deepening and enrichment of the campus conversation. It's wonderful to see the impact that the Clough Colloquium is having at this point in time, and I thank Dick Keeley and his team over in Fulton Hall for pulling these together each and every semester as we go along. It's especially wonderful, as Dick noted, to have a fellow Amherst College alumni here at Boston College this afternoon. Very few of us on campus note this with special pleasure. As Prime Minister of Greece from 2009 to November 2011, George Papandreou stood at the forefront of the global financial crisis. Named as one of Foreign Policy magazine's top 100 global thinkers in 2010 for making the best of Greece's worst year, he continues to speak with authority on the state of the Eurozone today and the future of the European Union. In these quite tumultuous times, few are better placed than Prime Minister Papandreou to provide insights into the current Euro crisis and the historic challenges it presents to democratic governance in Europe and really around the world. He is vice chairperson of the International Olympic Truce Foundation, an institution he actively promoted when the city of Athens was awarded the 2004 Summer Olympic Games. A passionate supporter of the Information Society and e-democracy, in 2003 he was selected as one of the 25 people who are changing the world of internet politics. Papandreou also held the portfolio of foreign minister, a position in which he served from 1999 to 2004, expanding his legacy as a leader of diplomatic bridge building and reiterating his commitments to stronger international relations. His administration spearheaded Agenda 2014, an initiative which seeks to advance the integration of the Western Balkan states into Europe. As Foreign Minister of Greece, he was also instrumental in the successful and rather surprising negotiation of rapprochement with neighbor and former rival Turkey, and he was also a key player in the negotiation that led to Turkey's candidacy for membership in the European Union in the late 1990s, and then Cyprus's entry into the Union in 2004. Around the world, Papandreou has successfully deployed green diplomacy with great impact, calling for more vigorous protection of the environment. He has championed human rights both at home and abroad, and has actively sought to maximize citizen participation in governance through information technologies. This Jesuit Catholic university is honored to host one of this generation's most influential and visionary world statesmen. Please join me in welcoming Prime Minister George Papandreou to Boston College.
Ladies and gentlemen, it's an honor to be speaking to you today as part of this prestigious Clough Colloquium series. First, let me start by thanking Dr. Quigley, fellow Amherst graduate, for his kind introduction. Let me give a very special word of thanks to the Clough Colloquium for this invitation to speak to you this afternoon. Most importantly, I want to give a very special thanks to you, Gloria and Chuck Clough, and to Bob and Judy Winston. The Clough Colloquium and the Winston Center for Leadership and Ethics are extraordinary resources for Boston College. It's actually inspiring to be here with you. The stated mission is one very dear to my heart: to understand and assess the most important societal needs, engage in the intellectual exploration of leadership and ethics in business and society. I'm truly honored to have been asked to be part of your speaker series this year. As many of you know, from the day I took office, I was at the center of the financial and economic storm. Yes, I had, as President Obama often told me, one of the most difficult jobs on this planet. So we would often compare notes as to whose was more trying. If my experience is worth something, it is to try to offer a few insights on how our world works or doesn't work today, what direction we might take in seeking to solve or deal with this complex new global world. But before I get into the gory details of the crisis in Europe, let me introduce myself, why I feel strongly about the future of our democracies by way of some personal stories. I was born in St. Paul, Minnesota, but I grew up in California. My father had fled from a Greek dictatorship in the 1940s and then taught economics at Berkeley. Yet I was well aware of my Greek identity, not only from my grandmother's bedtime stories on Greek gods, but because every time one of my teachers called out my last name, half the class would burst out in laughter. Now, I was not a Jones or a Smith, so my classmates usually changed my name to GP or Pappy, or even Curious George, named after the famous monkey because of my protruding ears. Actually, I kind of liked Curious George because he was one of my favorite characters, always trying to discover and always getting into trouble. Maybe it was a sign of what was in store for me later on in my life. I first traveled to Greece around 6 years old. My parents threw us 4 kids, 3 boys and 1 girl, in the back of the station wagon, no seatbelts then, and we took a week from motel to motel to get to New York. Upon arriving in New York, we sold the car and took an ocean liner to Greece, another 2-week trip to the port of Piraeus. I still remember my grandfather, a tall and lanky man with a top hat, waiting for us on the dock. I was his namesake, and he greeted me first. He grabbed my ear, pinched my cheek, and slapped me in the face. Uh-oh, I said, I'm already in trouble. What did I do? But I soon learned that that was how his show of deep emotion and overwhelming love was for me. He was a proud man. When I met him, he had already been in jail or exiled 5 times in his life fighting for democracy. And there would be a 6th time. I'll get to that later. But let me turn to the Greek crisis. Back in New York just a few days ago, I usually go there to meet in the United Nations. I sat next to Alpha Condé, the president of Guinea. His country is fighting the Ebola pandemic. He made a dramatic plea not to close borders, not to isolate his country. This, he said, would not solve the problem, nor will it stop the specter of contagion. He called for collective action from the international community. I found the debate about Ebola uncannily familiar to what I went through a few years ago when I was Prime Minister of Greece. I was elected into government on the slogan, either we change or we sink. People wanted change in Greece. But just a few days earlier, the previous Conservative government had announced that Greece's deficit was 6%. When I took office, I was stunned, angered, to discover that we were already sinking. The actual figure of the deficit was over 15%. For Greece, it was a moment of truth. For me, it was a critical test of my leadership. My option was full transparency, to come clean about our situation. Honesty, no matter how painful, was the only way to show all that we were ready to change. We were ready to take action immediately, and I had the support of the Greek people. But instead of being rewarded for uncovering the truth, markets reacted with growing fear. Soon some of my colleagues, prime ministers in the European Union, looked at me very strangely. Mostly those countries that felt their economies were vulnerable or at risk. I was reminded of a small islet off the beautiful island of Crete called Spinalonga. It's now a tourist destination, but years ago, lepers were sent there to be contained. So some countries, feeling that they may be attacked by market speculators, looked at me as if I had a disease. I was a leper. Don't touch. So I felt empathy with President Condé because, like Guinea, isolation or even an exit from the euro rather than cooperation was being prescribed for Greece. Others, much stronger economies, reacted differently. This is not my problem, Angela Merkel told me. This is a Greek problem, and you in Greece need to solve it. I asked for coordinated, united political support for my reforms, a strong show of collective political will to calm market fears and panic. The markets will understand, was Angela Merkel's reply. And we were repeatedly lectured, do your Hausaufgaben, which means homework in German. That was the motto. And yes, we needed to do our homework in Greece. For the work I did, I even received the Berlin Quadriga Award for Veracity for revealing the truth about our situation. However, the crisis not only revealed mistakes we made in Greece, more importantly, the crisis revealed the interdependence and flaws of the Eurozone governance structures, but even more so, the close interrelationship of the global economy. And therefore, Europe's reactions actually had the opposite effect. Discussing the Ebola case, I recently learned that the standard playbook of the World Health Organization is similar. In responding to epidemics, it calls for countries to wage their own battles, with the WHO giving only technical advice. So the markets feared in the same manner that Greece might be left on its own. But if Greece had that fate, why not Spain, or Italy, or even France? So again, the lesson I bring to our discussion today is that to deal with our problem in the European Union, or in the world, we needed cooperative, collective responses. Unfortunately, initial cooperation was rare and faltering, so we fell victim to a creeping epidemic of fear and speculation in the markets. It reminded me of a herd of cattle. When things were going well, all was calm. Up until the collapse of Lehman Brothers, Greece and other European countries had been able to borrow cheaply, seemingly risk-free. Rating agencies were assuring everyone that high-quality bonds, of the high-quality bonds we were buying. Once the bubble burst, every little sound seemed to provoke a stampede in the markets. Contagion had occurred, and now everyone thought Greece might be the tipping point for a global sovereign debt crisis. As a leader of my country, I had to consider all the potential consequences. First, the global repercussions. Leaders from everywhere called me. President Obama, worried about the prospect of a new global depression or recession, stood by me, and I thank him for that. Secondly, the possibility that the crisis in Greece would mean the unraveling of our common currency, the euro, or even of Europe itself. And last but not least, the plight of the Greek people if we defaulted on our debt. Many have asked me, how on earth could a small country such as Greece, with a GDP smaller than Boston's GDP, have the power to create financial havoc around the world? Well, now I hope I've given you a clue: the fear of contagion and the interconnected, globalized markets. But if you came from outer space to visit planet Earth just a few years ago, you might make the assessment that this interdependence, this globalizing world, was a network of strength and progress. And you would be partly right. Only yesterday, everything was bright. Democracy had triumphed, and the few holdouts were on their way to democratic change. The Berlin Wall was down, and Europe was uniting. The Arab Spring had torn down the heavy fixtures of aging dictators. The internet was to be the disruptor of monopolies, from news agencies to dogmatic ideologies to authoritarian regimes. Free trade spread throughout the globe, with Russia and China becoming the new members of the WTO. Economic rule of law was to replace the rule of the powerful, and economic integration and human networks were to make war impossible. McDonald's in Moscow and Beijing were symbols of a new brother or sisterhood. Yet suddenly the march of democracy started to reverse. In Russia or even Hungary, leaders have become semi-permanent. The Arab Spring has morphed into authoritarianism in Egypt, chaos in Libya, and a bloodbath and anarchy around Syria. China is struggling to come to terms with what wider repercussions democracy in Hong Kong might have. Our World Wide Web is connecting us all, yet it sometimes feels like a spider web, with many spiders ready to prey on us, from big companies to governments, from criminal mafias to online paparazzis spying on our private lives. Globalization and interdependence was assumed to be a positive power for cooperation, for democracy and peace. And yes, it can be, but it challenged us for proper global governance. The financial crisis of 2008 in Wall Street was a wake-up call that we were not managing our globe properly. Global integration without rules, codes of conduct, an ethical compass could become a nightmare of fragmentation, chaos, recession, unemployment, poverty, suffering, violence, and a constant fear of new, unexpected black swans. So how should we react? I fear that what I would call our knee-jerk reactions. For example, if we don't like what we see out there, we run home and close our doors. We seek the safety of a hideaway, seclusion, separation, secession, or isolation. Actually, I like to take my kayak out and row to small Greek islands to find my own sanity. And there have been many a time I tell myself, why not just stay there on a beautiful island with the goats, the gulls, the Greek yogurt, olive oil, fresh vegetables, fish and wine, looking over the turquoise sea. But let me take you to a Greek island I visited recently, Agathonisi, off the coast of Turkey. Isolated, somewhat barren, it has a population of 186 citizens. They mostly live off their land and sea, beautiful coasts, a few small taverns and shops. But if you dive deep down to the bottom of the seas around this island, you will find modern civilization has colonized the seabed with its waste: plastic bottles, clothes, tires, machine parts, and more. The Mediterranean Sea is also changing temperature and fauna. In some years, this island may be underwater. New species of fish have migrated because of climate change or tankers offloading water from exotic seas. And once in a while, the village will wake up in the morning, and in the middle of the square, hundreds of refugees will be waiting for them from Afghanistan, from Iraq, from Somalia, having been thrown overboard in the dark hours of the night from human traffickers. My point is a simple one. No man, no woman is an island. From the Islamic State with their foreign fighters amongst us, or the far-off pandemic of Ebola, we are all in this together. More and more, your problem is mine, and my problem is yours. It was clear as daylight to me when we could only deal with the financial crisis in a collective way. The deeper problems in Greece needed time and effort for change. Yet the markets were clamoring for immediate results. Let me give you an example. In Greece, it was not the deficit, but underlying structural issues of governance that were the root issues. Vested interest, clientelism, lack of transparency had captured our democratic institutions. In reality, they were problems of the functioning of our democracy. Brookings Institute has looked at the relationship between transparency and deficits. They found that if Greece was as transparent as, let's say, Sweden, we would reduce our deficit by 8% of GDP. So institutions that are accountable, transparent, efficient, do matter. Radical democratic change of institutions, and that is the platform I was elected on. We've made tremendous strides. We've consolidated 52 counties or states into 13, made major reforms of pension, education, the tax system. Greece loses billions every year in uncollected taxes. If we had a more efficient, progressive system, we never would have needed a bailout. We made a lot of progress on this front, even using imaginative methods. We implemented a tax on swimming pools as a luxury good, but found that no one was declaring them. What did we do? We used Google Earth to check for them. We seized 500 yachts from some of the rich who weren't paying taxes, imposed 15% tax on properties of offshore companies, lifted banking secrecy, and established a Department of International Administrative Cooperation to exchange tax information between countries. All government expenditures, local and central, were put online. A meaningful adjustment was finally underway in Greece, and it is bearing fruit. Investors are taking strong positions. Tourist arrivals have surged to a record 19-20 million visitors this year, which is astonishing considering our country is only about 11 million. Greece could become the wellness center for Europe, and we see growth in key sectors from aquaculture to renewable energy, mobile technology, to our Mediterranean diet, the Cretan diet. Even the US president likes Greek yogurt. So I believe it's time to take a long-term view of Greece, and Greece is full of promise and potential. As you would imagine, strengthening transparency institutions and making reforms means going against the grain of very strong vested interests. And yes, these reforms needed time for change. And the markets certainly didn't give us the time. Let me give you an example. When we negotiated the first support mechanism in the Eurozone, it was a fund to provide emergency funds for troubled economies because we couldn't access the markets to borrow. The summit of prime ministers took place on a Sunday. Why? Because that's when the global markets were closed. At 10 minutes to 2, after many hours of tough negotiations, one prime minister yelled at me and said, "Quick, we've got to close the negotiation in 10 minutes. I said, "Why?" He says, "Because in 10 minutes, now we were in Brussels, the markets are opening up in Japan. And if we haven't reached a decision, there'll be havoc in the markets." Well, what does this tell you about the influence of global markets on government policies? Can democracies take time, for example, for public deliberation, when a bond sell-off can happen in an instant? Another example, I was giving a speech to the Greek trade unions. Not an easy speech. I was announcing that their wages, their benefits, their pensions would be drastically cut, around 30%. And I would do so that Greece not go bankrupt. A journalist for a global news agency translating on the fly wrongly translated that I had announced Greece was going bankrupt. Before I stepped off the podium, that piece of misinformation had already traveled around the globe. And whatever reaches the internet seems to be both self-proliferating and indelible. We quickly corrected the mistake, but the damage had been done. But Europe, even the leadership itself, began to panic. In uncharted waters, few had a grasp of what to do. And in a time of panic, what do? We often refer to dogma, to higher authority, to strong leaders, wrongly so, because that often makes the problem even worse. In Europe, we did just that. The strongest were the Germans, the high authority were the technocrats, and the dogma was austerity. The belief that austerity alone would work. I'm not saying deficits don't matter. They absolutely do, and fiscal responsibility is of paramount importance. But it's also a simplistic view. All Greece had to do was to cut its deficits, and all would be well. Now that was like sort of enforcing an austere diet on a heart patient when she is in intensive care. Yet Greece, through major sacrifices, did just that. We are champions amongst the countries of the OECD today, having cut more and done so in the shortest time ever in OECD history. In my 2 years in office, Greece slashed a staggering 6.5 of its deficit. To put that figure into context, in the US, that's equivalent to cutting $1 trillion, the entire US defense and education budgets, and then some. But the social costs have been huge. 25% loss of GDP, a real depression, and 50% youth unemployment. Cuts rather than reforms were the priority of the Troika. That is neither fair nor sustainable for a society. But this speaks to a larger issue: how to effect meaningful change in an organization, be it a country or a company. The American environmental scientist Donella Meadows talked about leverage points that can produce systemic shifts. She said the easiest thing you can do is to change numbers, raise revenues, cut costs, reduce the number of employees, but this is actually the least effective way to reach a desired goal. It's hard to make a major change in physical infrastructure, but that pays greater dividends. It's even harder still to change the rules of the system, laws, bylaws, policies, guidelines, but this might bring about some monumental changes in a relatively short time span. Finally, the hardest thing you can do is to change the mindset of the organization, to reshape the beliefs and goals of the community. But if you can do that, she says, the sky is the limit. A friend of mine, Ron Heifetz, who teaches leadership at the Harvard Kennedy School, has a good analogy for how leaders need to respond to a crisis. Ron says, when you have a heart attack, you need to get straight to intensive care. There, the treatment is standard procedures, oxygen, transfusions, medicines, and so on. So at this initial stage, leadership is straightforward, almost technical. The more difficult part, assuming you survive, is afterwards, dealing with the root causes of the heart attack, changing your lifestyle, letting go of bad habits, instilling new patterns of behavior. And that requires a different type of leadership. It's not a solution you just deliver. It means creating the mindset for change. It's a different politics, a politics of education, a learning process through deeper participation where everyone takes on responsibility, everyone plays his or her part. That was and that is my vision for Greece. I called for a referendum to make sure our solutions were owned by the Greek people. Empowering our citizens in one way or another was of utmost and is of utmost importance. The only sure way to change a mindset and implement drastic reforms. Of course, President Sarkozy, when I announced the referendum, said, the markets are going to go crazy. And I said, but if we don't have the trust of the people, in the end, the markets will go crazy also. So here we were trying to change, to adapt, to save Greece, and we felt vulnerable, unprotected, as we confronted the whims, the speculators, the fears of global market forces. This began to overwhelm us. Now, today's younger generation will confront the most formidable and complex problems humanity has ever faced. An example is climate change. Of course, the financial crisis was one too. But climate change could wipe out civilization as we know it. And there is no dearth of issues or challenges on today's global scene. We asked them, the younger generation, to be adaptable, to be resilient, to be prepared. I will agree. But our generation has a responsibility. Haven't we stacked the odds heavily against them? Despite the fact that today's millennial generation may be the most educated and connected, haven't we created systems that are not only too big to fail, but too big to be accountable? Accountable to our societies, our natural environment, to future generations? Have we reneged on our own responsibilities, putting too much faith in markets alone that primarily seek profit and will not solve these problems in an equitable or sustainable way? How fair is that? Or do we do away with democratic processes? I've heard many say that democracy will create more chaos. Bring in the strong leaders, the autocrats, the high priests or experts that can act with lightning speed, that of the financial markets or media hype. Well, democracy may have its flaws, but in the end it delivers things no other system can. At its best, it delivers hope for change. It delivers a process where opposing views can coexist and respect each other. It delivers ownership of decisions. It guarantees freedom, which brings creativity, liberating our human potential. It can even mobilize, inspire, and unite. Finally, democracy was an innovation in ancient times to disrupt the concentration and abuse of power by the few. I say this because I believe we are not seeing an excess of democracy, but the opposite. Quite honestly, as I look at many of the global crises we face today, I see failing trust in governments as the primary problem, and failed governance means failed democracy. Consider Ebola. The crisis exists because of a lack of adequate public health systems in a number of countries in Western Africa. But those countries lack those systems because they lack accountable government systems. Consider Ukraine. There are certainly concerns about Russia, about geopolitics. But if you are Ukrainian, one of the most profound sources of instability is the corruption, a non-transparent government structure failing its citizens. Consider ISIS and the heartbreaking crisis facing over 10 million refugees of displaced persons. A crisis exists because of the lack of pluralism, where whole sections of society have been marginalized in Iraq and Syria. So concentration and abuse of power is the distinct characteristic of failed governance. However, our democracies in a global economy face what I would call new meta-problems. First, there's a growing paradox. We live in an age where the capacity of humankind surpasses any previous era. We have the knowledge, the resources, the expertise, the research capacity to solve most of our problems in today's world, to make poverty history. But we can't, or we're not. I believe one of the reasons is while the economy is global, our institutions are local, national. As a result, we politicians find it increasingly difficult to deliver solutions at the national level. And this is becoming a fundamental problem for our democracies. That's why many people are talking about relocalizing, helping cities, but others talking about global governance. Our citizens rightly see that we are not delivering. From my experience, there are other crucial meta-problems. With the emerging markets, capital moves to find new opportunities. But this is not only capital flight towards opportunity, but it is also a flight away from obligations. In the past, the social partners, as we call them in Europe, the employers, the employees, and the state guaranteed a basic bargain. That's a word that Roosevelt used to use. A bargain where capitalism was humanized. Yes to profits, but there would be an equitable share of wealth, providing for education, health, employment, pensions, infrastructure, standards of living. Unfortunately, as capital has flowed into new emerging markets in pursuit of greater returns, they have left their social obligations behind. They move to countries that often have no labor standards, no minimum wages, no collective bargaining, no health or environmental standards, no pension or welfare system, often no human rights. So yes, they have a competitive advantage. With many left out in our societies, this is not a sustainable or fair model. A second problem is one I encountered as Prime Minister. One of the easiest ways transnational corporations get tax breaks is that taxable profits and incomes are funneled abroad to tax havens or offshore companies. There's a discussion now in the United States about what you call tax inversion. This is highway robbery for countries in dire need, such as Greece, or even the US when we're tackling debts and deficits. A non-transparent global financial banking system incentivizes such behavior. Around $32 trillion in hidden financial assets are held offshore globally. And while the G20, the 20 biggest economies of the world, have taken decisions on tax havens, little has been done. Indeed, some have called the G20 the G0 because of its inadequacy in dealing with global problems. Financial institutions are so international that they are no longer bound by national norms or rules that apply to the rest of us commoners, like paying taxes. Lack of transparency is also feeding the growth of crony capitalists, oligarchs, global mafias, without any real check. This further undermines the rule of law, democratic accountability, and change. And this brings me to a third meta problem. I'll give you a mystery quote. Here's the quote. As long as the problems of the poor are not radically resolved by rejecting the absolute autonomy of markets and financial speculation, and by attacking the structural causes of inequality, no solution will be found for the world's problems, or, for that matter, to any of its problems. Inequality is the root of social ills. Well, this is not a quote from Occupy Wall Street, it's a quote from Pope Francis. This year, inequality was cited as the #1 challenge at the World Economic Forum in Davos, Switzerland. Not exactly a radical leftist group. But this not only creates injustices. Our democratic institutions are captured, and I saw this in Greece, through the concentrated power of lobbyists or even buying up politicians through outright corruption. So insecurity, inequality, injustice, lack of a rule of law, failed governance create a sense of powerlessness and frustration. It's fodder for authoritarianism, for fundamentalism, for hatred, for violence. And I know that feeling. My grandfather was elected Prime Minister of Greece, but later overthrown and then arrested by the military dictatorship. My father, also in politics, had been arrested on the same night of the coup. A gun was put to my head to force my father to reveal himself and come out from where he was hiding. I remember well what it meant to live under a dictatorship. It was the denial of simple freedoms, even absurd rules. Girls had to wear skirts below their knees. As young men, we were not allowed to grow sideburns or wear bell-bottom pants. Do you know what bell-bottom pants are? Lest we look too much like a group of long-haired musicians called the Beatles. But it was also persecution, torture, imprisonment for many. My family was constantly under surveillance. When in exile, I became a member of a resistance movement that espoused armed struggle to overthrow the dictators. However, I soon changed my mind about using violence. Because my grandfather died when he was under house arrest, and his funeral would become the first mass protest against the military junta. I was there. People protested loudly, at the same time mourned the old man of democracy, as he was called. My revelation was that it was not weapons, but his quiet suffering, his commitment that had inspired people to defy the curfew, the possible arrest, or even torture. So from my experience, I can sincerely say that violence only begets more violence and suffering. But peaceful resistance, like many showed in the recent revolution in Egypt, is not always the obvious for many youngsters, for many of the youth around the world. More worrying is the violent fragmentation along ethnic and religious belief. Greece itself is situated in a multi-religious region. Religious wars and populists whipping up fears were at our doorstep only a few years ago in the Balkans. As a young boy, I remember the dictators in Greece, like many authoritarian figures around the world, trying to draw their legitimacy not by convincing the people, but by usurping, by abusing, I would say, symbols such as the nation, the flag, or religion. That way, they proclaim that they have a divine right. And if you have divine legitimacy, then even taking a life is your prerogative. So the Greek dictators used to say that they were there to save the Greece of the Greek Orthodox. My grandfather, a son of a priest, in his last statement before he died, said to BBC, he was mocking the dictatorship. He said, "Yes, we are a nation of Greek Orthodox citizens who are, however, Catholically protesting." Being deeply a Democrat, he respected individual views, never used religion to impose his own view. That is why I subscribe to Boston College's philosophy expressed in its mission statement, rooted in a worldview that encounters God in all creation and through all human activity, especially in the search for truth in every discipline, in the desire to learn, and in the call to live justly together. This philosophy is, I believe, at the foundation of what a new global order needs. And I say this also from experience. Greece is a neighbor to a very large Muslim country, Turkey. When I became Minister of Foreign Affairs, we were on the brink of war with Turkey. Many resisted Turkey's candidacy for membership into the European Union because they said Turkey is a Muslim country. How could they espouse democracy? I, of course, had grown up traveling around the world to believe that democracy was a universal value, that under our veneer of differences was the possibility for community. Although Greece was initially dead against Turkey joining the European Union, I said, why not, as long as we share common values, as long as we create a framework, a basis for rules of the game, as long as we agree on a code of conduct. And that is what Europe has stood for, a family of shared values after so many wars, holocausts, and conflict. Then a few months later, a massive earthquake took place near Istanbul. Thousands were trapped under the rubble. I decided to take a risk. I publicly called on the Greek people to give blood. The response was overwhelming. In massive numbers, Greeks ran to blood banks to support their Turkish neighbors, the former enemy. One Turkish minister stated, "Turkey will not accept Greek blood." But my counterpart, Foreign Minister Ismail Cem, whom we became very good friends with afterwards, also taking a risk, intervened and welcomed the gesture. We then sent a team of rescuers to dig for survivors. And the most moving scene was when a Greek rescuer pulled out a young Turkish boy alive from under the rubble. Turkish newspapers ran titles thanking us in Greek. A month later, the Turks came out to help us in another earthquake, when another earthquake struck just outside Athens. And very soon, our citizens took up this initiative. They began to take ownership of this peace process, what I called people's diplomacy, from trade to sports to civic organizations. And before we hosted the Olympic Games, Ismail Cem, my Turkish counterpart, and I signed the Olympic truce, as was mentioned earlier, an ancient tradition to vow for maintaining peace during the Games. We then took this book for signatures and went around the world asking for leaders to sign up. So President Clinton, Nelson Mandela, Simon Peres, Yasser Arafat were only some of the leaders to sign it. Breaking down stereotypes, racism, the fear of the other, searching for the common values was what kicked off a new era for our Greek-Turkish relations. And today, tourism is booming between the two countries. We had turned the crisis into an opportunity. It may sound outlandish looking at the war-torn region of the Mideast today, but in the long term, our task is to integrate these societies into a common global community of values. This has been the essence of the European project, one of peoples being able to live together, even though they're different cultures, languages, religions, traditions, sharing, however, basic values. Even if the financial crisis tested our values and fostered racism and stereotypes, even a newborn nationalism, Europe continues to be an experiment, a work in progress on how our global society might cooperate. A possible beacon on how we will create a sense that each and every one of us is a global citizen, respected for what she or he is, irrespective of race, ethnicity, religion, sexual orientation, or gender, stewards of our common planet. If there's a lesson to be learned, it is to deny the politics of fear, of stereotypes, of what I call tribal politics. Can we do this? No easy solutions here, but let me be bold enough to think out of the box. But out of the box sometimes needs a compass. I often return to another social experiment called ancient Athenian democracy. If you stand on the hill in front of the Acropolis, you can see a number of historic places of importance for democracy. First is the Agora. Agora in Greek means both marketplace, but also a place where people debate publicly, doing politics, a commons for the people. You see, we need to rethink how markets and politics work together to serve our citizens, not the other way around. In a globalized economy, we need global rules and regulations for our financial world, our global economy, so that we use resources in a sustainable and, crucially, a just way. High inequality, tax havens, opaque financial institutions must stop. A global basic bargain to provide for our global citizens needs to be established. And here, the United States of America and the European Union must take the lead. An opportunity is now the new trade agreement which is being negotiated, where we might be able to lay down some ground rules for the world. Now, a second view from the Acropolis, you will see on a clear day, looking towards the sea, some beautiful islands off the coast. They were in ancient Greece separate states, but they were also all Greek. So what kept them together? Well, a philosopher called Isocrates said that being Greek was having a Greek education. Education becomes central to politics. Why? Politics in ancient times was a revelation that we, the citizens, can take our fate into our hands. We needed no tyrant, no dogma to decide for us. If we could change the world, which was the revelation then of ancient Greece, then theater, philosophy, science, music became education that would empower us for creating an even better society. Athletic games became crucial. Why? They not only built healthy bodies, but a sense of respect for the rule of law, as with the Olympics. Education inculcated common values of citizenship, rights, and responsibilities in the polis. Could we envision today the Universal Declaration of Human Rights becoming central to all our educational systems? Could we develop what a German philosopher, Jürgen Habermas, has called constitutional patriotism, or that would be patriotism towards a common value system superseding our distinct identities? Can we make learning a commonwealth of humanity, inculcating a spirit of inquiry, using information technology for access for all on this planet? But education was not only passive back in ancient Athens. Across from the Acropolis is the Pnyx. There, democracy was practiced both by learning to debate and to decide on collective action through direct democracy. But democracy was also seen as an innovation, I repeat, a disruptive innovation to counter the concentration or abuse of power, hubris, as it was called in Greek, a blasphemy to the gods. Today, we are challenged to translate these concepts into our modern and globalizing world. How do we use the power we have in our hands, the amazing technologies, the financial resources, the power of media and communication? How do we make sure it does not become concentrated in the hands of the few or abused? How do we reimagine or reclaim democracy in a very different globalized world. Use big data, crowdsourcing, online deliberation as tools for deepening democracy across borders, empowering our citizens locally and nationally to participate creatively, creating new social institutions globally that allow us to collectively solve and deal with our global challenges. So challenged we are to humanize globalization. Otherwise, we will see the horrible fruits of suffering, violence, absolutism, and injustice take over on our planet. This may sound both difficult and lofty, but one thing I want to leave with you. In ancient Athens, those who did not participate, those who did not take on public responsibilities, were called private persons, or idiotes in Greek, idiot in English. If anything, our world needs no idiots. Participation and preparation for citizenship, service and leadership in global society is your motto, the motto of Boston College's mission. That's what you declare. It is more necessary today than any other time in humanity's history. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Prime Minister. In America, we tend to take democracy for granted, and it's anything but. When Greece assumed democracy as its political structure, two other nations did the same decade, which was the 70s. One was Spain and one was Chile. All three are very strong and stable democracies today. In the 1990s, of course, after the fall of the former Soviet Union, any number of nations suddenly became pseudo-democracies. They had elections. They all had elections. But that's not the secret to democracy. Most are sliding back into one or another form of authoritarianism, Russia being the most strong examples of that, because they never built the underlying democratic institutions. I'd like to really thank the Prime Minister, not only for addressing us today, but for being in Greece at its most trying moment. I was there in the middle of 2011 when that crisis hit. It had the strong democratic institutions, and because of your leadership, Mr. Prime Minister, they stabilized. I run a little investment firm in Boston, and we actually own 3 small Greek banks. Well, they're not so small in Greece. Alpha Bank, Piraeus, and National Bank of Greece. And they've restructured and they've come back as viable institutions, which means they can lend again to Greek businesses that are starting. And I think if the Prime Minister wasn't there at that moment, it's hard to tell what would have happened. He provided very strong leadership at a very critical time. And we thank you for that.
Thank you very much.
I think the Prime Minister is prepared to take questions. There are 2 microphones, and you can probably police it yourself if you just line up behind that one and just share one after the other. We'll get started with the question and answers. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Prime Minister Papandreou. It was a pleasure listening to your talk, very inspiring. And can you hear me okay?
Yes, just your name.
Yes, Panagiotis Metaxas. I'm a professor of computer science at Wellesley College, and I appreciate your talk at BC, in particular because your talk was very inspiring, as appropriate for an educational institution when you're talking to young people who are eager to go forth and fix all the things our generations did not fix. One thing, however, that I would like you to comment upon has to do with the fact that throughout your talk, there was another educational thing that I think we should not miss to stress. And that has to do with the fact that we do not appear in life around our 50s. We come through life and we have a whole track record. It is impressive that at the time of crisis, we face our devils and we can kind of realize what happened. But it is very important, I think, for young people to realize that going through a whole life living in a state of corruption, in a state of accommodating those who have the power to abuse, and suddenly realizing that, oh my God, that we have to change, is not really a very viable plan. That's why your party went from being voted by 1 out of 2 Greeks, now it is voted by less than 1 out of 10. What we had seen, in other words, was a whole government, actually 2 governments that for a number of years were lying to the people because there was easy cash out there, that they were able essentially to provide without any worry about the financial future of their children, and eventually come to a crisis. And since you nicely made the connections to ancient Greece, the way that ancient Athenian democracy fell was exactly by the same pattern. When Demosthenes was trying to persuade Athenians to save some money to defend themselves against the Macedonians, this did not happen, and eventually Athens fell. So I think the lesson that we should, I hope, stress is that being reliable, being truthful, should be something that follows you throughout your life, not suddenly later on in life.
I couldn't disagree with that. I think it's appropriate. And I have, what I am saying today is what I had said yesterday and what I've said many years ago. I do believe that we've had in Greece a system that, you're right, it was a democracy, but we also had to, and you were very right in saying that, democracy is not just elections. We basically became a more stable democracy after 1974. Before then, yes, we had periods of democracy, but they were interrupted by dictatorships, by authoritarian leaders, by civil wars, by wars, and only the last 40 years have we really had, 40, 50 years have we really had democracy. That's not a very long time. It's a time of a lifespan or a generation or two. But I remember when I first came to Greece after the dictatorship, I had lived in Sweden in exile, and I had been inspired by what the Swedes were doing in adult education. It was actually in civic education. They were training their citizens, and Sweden had a long period of democracy, in being active in society. So I decided I would do the same thing in Greece, and actually we called study circles all over Greece. About 100,000 people at some point participated. And I remember that in the cooperatives, I would talk to the farmers, and they would say, do we actually have the right to elect the head of the cooperative? And I said, of course you do. I mean, that's what a cooperative means. But they didn't know that. I remember when I was first elected as a deputy, some of my friends came to me and they said, now you've got to change your clothes. You've got to drive a black car, a Mercedes if possible. You have to bang your fist on the desk so that people are a little bit afraid of you. And I almost believed that. But what that was that they hadn't seen a model of a different type of a leader. When you live under an authoritarian regime for years and years and years, and I'm sure that's similar in Egypt, I'm sure that's similar in other countries that are now changing, the image of who is a good leader is still that old authoritarian model. I quickly changed that, and I said, I don't care if people don't like me in a different way, then I'll get out of politics. I'll go back to my dream of living on a little island. But actually, people did respect that. So, yes, Greece has been going through lots of changes. One of the things I think we didn't do, and I've said this many years, and I think this is one thing you mentioned, the structures of the state in Greece were structures that were remnants of authoritarian pasts, bureaucracy, clientelism, from dictatorships, spying on people. We used to have, every citizen used to have their so-called, they call a file, and people were being followed, what kind of political beliefs you had. Now that is a bureaucracy that's not efficient. We didn't change that bureaucracy as much as we should have. And I think that's the responsibility of the parties that did govern the country for quite a few decades. But that was one of the things the first things I started to change by bringing, one of the very simple things was to put everything online. The second thing was to have a census. We didn't know how many public servants we had in the government. I asked how many public servants, nobody knew. So I actually had to say, and people were saying, well, we're getting them, we're asking them to tell them. And I said, how do you know that we will have that? When some ministry tells you that you've got 1,000 public servants, how do you know that they're not 2,000? So what I did is I said, we'll get them online, and every public servant will have to register, and if they don't register online, they won't get paid. And then we found out how many public servants we would have. But these are the types of problems we had. But there's one thing I do disagree with you. It's very simple to say, this party and that party, you're all the same. I hear that a lot in many countries. You're all the same. That's all the same. It's not true. There are some politicians that are the same, but there are other politicians. I'm not trying to say that, there are always differences, but there can be differences, and I think some politicians do make differences. I wasn't the one, and we weren't the ones that created the debt and deficit, doubling the debt and a deficit of 15.6%, which was a shock. We were saddled with it. And I think there was huge responsibility. So I think one has to be just also in apportioning responsibility to where it is, because otherwise we are also creating another types of logic. If everybody is the same, then why democracy? If everybody is the same, then there's no hope. If everything is the same, let's go home and be idiots.
You've been compared to Gorbachev in the sense of some of the critics saying that you moved too fast, too soon, without adequate international support and without adequate internal support. I mean, if you had to do it again, and you might if these structural reforms don't work, a lot of the indicators in Greece you mentioned are positive, but there are many that are also quite negative. The bad loans that the European Central Bank are going to be buying, is that just going to create another crisis? But if you had to do it over again, what have you learned from this about leadership in a crisis, about that charge of moving too fast, too soon, without enough internal and external support? Thank you.
Yeah, well, I think I've been accused both of moving too fast, I've been accused of moving too slow. So I think, it's very easy to do, what is it called, Monday morning quarterbacking. And it's useful to do it, because then you can look at things. And when you have the bird's eye view, you can see things that you wouldn't see on the field. You're not sure. If somebody throws you a ball, you may not see it coming to you, but you may. You may not see somebody who's going to tackle you. You may not see that there's going to be a block here or there. You can't be sure, but you've got to use whatever you have, whatever tools you have. And basically what you have to do also is not feel that things are just going to solve themselves. You've got to take initiatives. So I did take initiatives, and I did take risks. Had I not done that, I think we may have just fallen off the cliff. So yes, many things could have been done differently. For example, I called for a referendum in 2011. We didn't have a law of how we do referenda. I should have maybe made that law in 2009 or 2010, so we could have actually gone to a referendum maybe earlier. But I hadn't expected that we would actually need a second program, and that we would need to go to a referendum for a second program. So these things, yes. But I believe that trying to bring in more participation, which I did, but even more so, would have been very important. Secondly, I think another thing on the European level, I talked to my European counterparts and I said, listen, we have a Greek problem, but this is a European problem also, the Eurozone problem. The markets are not worried about Greece per se only. Greece was, such a small part of the GDP of the Eurozone. Why should we be creating havoc? What they were seeing was a systemic risk. They were seeing a system that wasn't working. They were saying, well, if this happens to Greece, maybe it'll happen elsewhere. That's a contagion effect. I tried to convince them, but they were looking at me saying, maybe you're just saying that to get out of your own responsibilities. I wasn't. Maybe I should have been more forceful in trying to convince them. But had Europe taken a forceful stand, we would have had more time. What Mario Draghi did in 2012, when he came out from he's the head of the European Central Bank, he said to the markets, I will do whatever it takes to save the euro. I will buy bonds. I will intervene in the market. I will keep the interest rates low. And that was when Italy and Spain were about not being able to borrow because the rates were going too high. Had they done that, had Europe done that in 2010 when I had the problem, and it wasn't Italy and Spain, which were very big, too big to fail, I don't think we would have even needed a bailout from the European Union. So there were problems at the regional and at the global level too. And of course, the global level, the financial crisis was what created the underlying psychology which was then hitting not only Greece but other countries too.
Prime Minister, first of all, thank you very much for your time. My question to you is, what do you
Your
think?
name?
Juan. I'm a freshman here at Boston College. Prime Minister, what do you think is the current biggest threat to the stability of the European Union? Is it mostly a geopolitical problem, especially with Russia?
Stability
Of the European Union.
Of the
Is it mostly a geopolitical problem with Russia particularly, or is it mostly an economic problem?
I think it's neither. I think it's more a political problem, an internal problem. You see, Europe, as I said, Europe is a project where we put our fates together. So, if you go to Greece, a village near mine where my grandfather comes from, just on the other side of the mountain, there was a massacre by the Nazis. They killed all men, all boys, put fire to women in a school. Luckily they were saved. And there were many things like this happened. We got over that in Europe. We actually started to work together. We started to say, this is the past. No war never again. We had our differences. Let's not bicker about borders. Let's not bicker about minorities. Let's work together. That was the basic fabric of the European Union. That's the magic of what Europe is. What happened with the financial crisis is we started getting into a blame game. We started getting into this easy blame game where I was hearing things like, oh, you Greeks, you're lazy, you don't work, you on the beach all the time, you're drinking ouzo, dancing zorba. We do that also, and you're welcome to come to Greece. So I heard that from official mouths, from people high up in governments around Europe. And I looked at statistics in the OECD, and I was shocked to see we were working more hours than any other European. But this was the stereotype. Now, I think that this sort of nationalistic and xenophobic or prejudicial climate in Europe has grown because of the financial crisis, and it has undermined this sense of solidarity and working together and cooperating together. That's why I think we have what we've seen, these populist movements, these sort of nationalist movements, these racist movements. We have to come out and say, listen, we work together. The problem is not whether the Germans are austere or the Greeks are lazy. There are deeper systemic issues. Let's look at them and let's solve them together. That, I think, is the biggest problem. That will strengthen Europe. And when we are stronger, yes, we will have a different voice vis-a-vis Russia. We'll have a different voice vis-a-vis what's happening in the Middle East. We will have a more potent voice around the world.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, Mr. Prime Minister. My name is Michael Razis. I am a senior at Newton North High School. I suppose what I'm wondering is just if you could please outline what are several things that you think can be immediately implemented in order to put Greece back onto a solid path of economic recovery. I've visited Greece a number of times, and I've spoken to relatives, many of whom are small business owners, and in just the past recent years, they see the economic recovery as very slow, if there even is any. And I suppose I was also wondering what you think can be done to bridge the gap between the outline of ideas to be implemented in order to instill change and actually changing?
What part of Greece did you go to?
Zakynthos.
Oh, Zakynthos, okay. Well, Zakynthos is actually Zakynthos is a beautiful island. Do you come from there? Do you have
Yes,
relatives
my
there?
father's side, yeah.
Beautiful island. And I would say it hasn't been hit as hard as some other parts of Greece by the crisis. Particularly the hard-hit areas are the cities, where there were lots of civil servants, large number of youth, a lot of companies also that were getting subsidies from the government and so on, and those have been cut. So they've been really hit, and there's high unemployment there. Luckily, on the islands, tourism has kept them afloat, and that's been important. But I would say that because of this policy in Europe that, just cutting deficits, the U.S. did a different thing. After the crisis in 2008, the U.S. Said we need to infuse into our economy some liquidity. We need to make sure that we don't have a deep depression. And in fact, it worked better than in Europe. In Europe, this was just austerity. And what's happened is we've been going into a continued deeper recession. So Greece has lost 25% of its GDP because of this. So I think that what we needed is a European-wide program, like a federal program in the U.S., to invest, public investment, working with private companies also, but which would build up, let's say, infrastructure, green energy grid, that's geopolitical also, invest in innovation, startups, venture capital, things that are IT, things like that, which I think would not only give jobs, but make us much more competitive at the global level. We haven't done that. That's now being discussed. In Greece, what's happening is, of course, people have, because of the cutting of the deficits, we had to raise tax very high, we had to cut spending. Now that, particularly in the middle class, the lower class too, but the middle class has been hit. People had sort of some money at home or some money in their bank. That's been used up, and now it's becoming much more difficult. So growth is needed. Now Greece has potential. I mentioned tourism. We still have lots of potential for tourism. Being a wellness center, our Greek Mediterranean diet. IT is also an important area. We have people that want to come invest. China is investing in Greece right now. You mentioned your investment, and thank you very much for that. Greek banks now are much healthier, still not ready to lend as they did before, and maybe that's partly good, but it's also partly bad because they're just looking too much at their accounting, and not at what some of the real opportunities in the economy. And so that's one of the reasons why we're talking about a banking union in Europe also, to make sure that depositors feel quite guaranteed, and that people are not feel that they're so risk averse to take some initiatives and some investments. So yes, I think that even though the statistics show that we're on a much better path, we've cut our deficit, we have a primary surplus, it's called, we're not creating any new debts, we have a pension system which is much more viable and so on, which is very good for the future generations. At the same time, without growth, it's really squeezing our citizens and our economy. So they're feeling it right now. And it's a crucial point right now in Greece, I think, both politically and economically.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for coming, Mr. Prime Minister. My name is JJ, and Greece is a really beautiful country. I would love to go to the island you mentioned someday.
Please do.
But sorry, my question is not about Greece, but about Africa. You mentioned the outbreak of Ebola in Africa is partly due to the inefficient health system in Africa, and that's because of the inefficient government system there. And what do you think we can do as college students for this? And how can college students get more involved in international affairs and international issues? Thank you.
Well, good question. First of all, what I was basically saying with Ebola, and there are other pandemics that are out there that we have to deal with, from malaria to AIDS and so on. But this is a new one, so people I think are focusing on it, and it's a difficult one too. to deal with. What I'm basically trying to say is that the weakest link, so we're so interdependent that the weakest link is our strength. So that means that where there's a weak link, that can create problems for even the strongest amongst us. Because we're so interdependent, which means we have to be engaged to help countries, societies, to move forward. I mean, it's in our interest, whether you're a United States citizen, whether you're a European citizen, it's in our interest to see flourishing democracies in Africa, to see growth in Africa, to see environmental standards, labor standards in Africa, because that will mean there will be healthier communities in all ways, and that'll be better for all of us. Not only the economy, but just the whole sense of justice and so on. And they won't be prey to fundamentalists, they won't be prey to violence, they won't be prey to diseases as easily. So one thing, I think there's a tradition here in the United States, and I know you come from China, but there's a very strong tradition of volunteerism here in the US. Learn from that. I think there are a few other countries maybe, but I think the US has one of the strongest traditions of personal initiative, of service. And I've done some teaching recently. I was a student here, but I've done some teaching recently in the United States, in Harvard and Columbia University. So I'm in touch with lots of the younger generation. And although my generation was very politicized and we were active, and students in the younger generation are less happy with the parties for a number of reasons, for politics. But they're in politics in a different way. Politics comes from the word polis, or city, or citizen. They're citizens in a different way. They want to be volunteers and active in local government, or maybe in NGOs or overseas and so on. I would say for anyone, move ahead, do that. Take initiatives. It's an education. It's part of learning in the world, and it'll be something valuable for you for your whole life. But it will also help other human beings, and I think that's very much appreciated.
Hello, my name is Georgiana Mihuts, and my question for you is as follows. Assuming you have attended plenty similar public gatherings to the one today, and that you were asked plenty of questions, what is the most memorable question you were asked, and how did you answer it?
Now, that's unfair, because you wanted to ask a difficult question, and you're asking me to ask the difficult question. Difficult question. Yeah, well, I usually get a question which says, what was your biggest mistake? That's always a difficult question, because you're not really sure about what might be a mistake and whether it was a mistake or not. I usually would say that I tried to pass a referendum in Greece, and I think it would have been really crucial, and I'll tell you why. It's not just asking the people what they want. Greece has lived through its history of domination, of invasion, of foreign powers playing a role in Greek society. When Greece was first liberated from the Ottoman Empire in the 1830s, first of all, it had a Bavarian king, but secondly, there were three parties. You know what the three parties were called? One was called the British Party, the other was called the French Party, and the third was called the Russian Party. So where was the Greek Party? So this just shows that we were sort of very much dominated. So when we got into this financial crisis, all of a sudden there was another triumvirate, the Troika, coming to Greece, and they were dictating what should be done. So I felt we had to take possession, we had to take ownership of our own decisions. We had problems in Greece. Yes, the European Union had problems, yes, the global financial system, but we had to look at our own house too. And only if the Greeks felt that this was their decision would that be more viable and more quick and more effective. And I think had we done that, Greece had moved forward more quickly. And I think we would have had, these extreme parties would not exist, like the Golden Dawn, things like that, the neo-Nazi parties. So yes, I would go back, I would really try to have gotten that referendum through.
Thank you, Prime Minister. Kieran Doyle is my name. I'm from the Edward M. Kennedy Institute for Conflict Intervention in Maynooth, Ireland. And I'm a member of Boston College Fellowship here now in the Irish Institute. Thank you for an inspiring presentation. There were many aspects that were absolutely, I suppose, reflected the Irish experience of austerity. We had to go through a troika, bailouts, and all the ancillary challenges that ensued. Personally, I lost my job twice during that period, and it was a very difficult period for our nation. Just to make a comment on that, at the moment, Ireland is now seeing, having taken the austerity, Ireland is now seeing growth levels of approximately 5%. And the feeling on the streets is that we are now emerging from those challenges. The biggest long-term issue that we could possibly identify is that children nowadays may not be in a position to replicate the comfortable lifestyles that their parents had, and their aspirations may have to be tempered. Would you like to comment on that?
Yes. First of all, on Ireland, I think one thing we wrongly did in Europe was we sort of had one suit fits all. So Ireland and Greece were different cases, and that's why you're seeing growth rates now. Your case was that basically you took on the debts or the liabilities of the banks. The banks were the ones in Ireland that had made major mistakes. Now, maybe some of the Irish leadership were, somehow guilty also of letting this happen. There may have been inside deals and so on, so the lack of transparency, that may have been a problem too. But generally, Ireland has a much more efficient and transparent public sector and governance and so on. And you also have been connected in other ways too, to the international, to the global economy, which has kept you being able to have revenues and growth. So once you dealt with that issue, you were already sort of in a good position to move on. Of course, your issue hasn't completely been dealt with, because there's a big controversy now about shouldn't you have gotten a haircut, because why should the Irish citizens or the Irish taxpayer pay for the mistakes of the bankers? And we had a big discussion, because the head of the central bank then, Trichet, I had talked to him about possible haircut for the Greek debt, and he was dead against it, and he obviously was dead against a haircut for the Irish banks. But if you do have a haircut, or if there is some liabilities are borne by the banks themselves, I assume that would be a much more of a burden off your backs. So that would be one important point. The second is that if Europe is continuing with its slow growth and recession, then yes, the next generation will have to have much lower ambitions, financially at least, than our generations. I think there's a third question, which is more general. We have to start thinking in around the world that our consumer society, as it is today, is not that healthy. Whether what we consume, not only for our own personal health, but for our environment, for how much should we consume. I think we have to find in our societies sustainable ways of growth, which will make sure that we don't go beyond our planetary limits, and that's going to be a much more difficult issue. But I think we could have happy and fulfilled lives if we make sure that we have basics and we don't simply want to consume more and more in our lives. I think we can find other things of happiness, particularly if we have good environments, some basic healthcare, education, as many of the social model in Europe is very much. So yes, there will be challenges ahead for the next generation, and we have a responsibility to guide this world, today's world, to make sure that the next generation doesn't suffer.
Good evening, Prime Minister. My name is Amélie Trieux. I am a freshman here at Boston College. Throughout your speech, I heard many mentions about European unity, and I'd like you to address that question. For the last decade or so, I grew up hearing about the internal tensions that are not limited to the Roma, the negative aspects of the euro, many concerns various European nations have about the European Union, especially Great Britain wanting to break apart. Could you please address these issues and whether or not your opinions about the real strength of European unity and how that stands?
A good question, and I think it's going to be one of the central questions for Europe as the years ahead. The European project began after the Second World War as a coal and steel industrial policy, and then it slowly linked us together. And we based it on the fact that we said, okay, first of all, we respect each other. Our borders, our nations, we work together. Secondly, we respect basic values, human rights, open markets, a social system that makes sure that our societies are not unjustly unequal, but we have social cohesion, social network, respect of minorities, religious differences. Thirdly, we said we have to have some kind of a governance system of this European Union where we make decisions together. Well, we then brought in treaties, the European Parliament, the European Council, which is the prime ministers or the ministers of the different countries, a justice system, and the euro, of course, is one of the Schengen, which is the non-visa thing, and which is very important for travel. We used to travel, we had to go through, in the Cold War, you could, almost not go from one country to another. Today, you can go from one country without even being checked. More like, going from one state to another in the United States. Well, the euro, of course, the currency, a common currency, was also important, but it was incomplete. It's sort of like having a dollar, but having also another currency. Let's say Argentina was pegged to the dollar, but it didn't have the U.S. federal government providing, the necessary things like unemployment fees or infrastructure or guarantees of the bonds and so on. So we have an incomplete structure of the euro. And what's happened then is when the crisis hit, that really tore us apart. I would say it's sort of like we were all sort of different boats tied together. We tied one next to each other. But these boats some were big boats, some were smaller boats, some had modern engines, some had a little bit older engines, some had good hulls, some had some holes in the hulls, letting water in. All that was all right when the sea was calm. When the storm hit, then we were start being pulled apart, and some people were saying, I don't want to drag these other guys that are so slow. And some of the smaller ones were saying, maybe I should, get away, so maybe I could, I would not whipped around by the winds. So we have to find a way where, rather than accusing each other, really look at the storm, rather than accusing each other of who's wrong. And I was in one of these boats called Greece, which had water in it, and it was sinking, and it was not running very quickly. And people were saying, bail out the water, and at the same time you've got to patch up and so on, and I accuse you and things like that. Well, we have to get away from these accusations and say, we're in this together. Let's work together. We have to deal with these storms. We have to deal with these crises and help our citizens. And what I would say is that we began as a peace project amongst ourselves. Now we have to become a project of how we together deal with globalization, with humanizing globalization, with making sure that we don't simply accept all the negatives of globalization in our societies. We don't simply say that we have to simply cut wages to be competitive, or we have to cut all our health systems to be competitive with China, or with India, or with some other country. That we can actually keep some of these basic values, maybe not exactly the same, but the basics of these, to keep our citizens together. And that's where Europe, I think, has to be successful, but it hasn't been up to now. And so it has to change its narrative and really sort of show that working together is much stronger rather than accusing each other. That's what I think the political dimension. But it's going to be very important. I think I would add just one more thing to that. People have to own the project. The European Union was an elite project also. Jean Monnet, was he sort of said, well, we'll link together and then people will just follow. I think we have to make it a bottom-up project also. And that's, I think, where countries like Britain or the UK feel somewhat outside, because they feel that, decisions are made in Brussels. How much do we really own these decisions? So making Europe, the structures of Europe, more democratic. I even said, why don't we elect a president of Europe? Why don't we elect a president? Not, there was a discussion. We had European elections for the Parliament, and they were sort of semi-fake kind of candidates. They said we're a candidate, but we didn't vote for them. We voted for parties separately. But what if we actually had candidates and voted, and so that the citizen of the UK would say, yes, I voted for that person, and so I'm part of this process. What if we had a Europe-wide referendum as a possibility, let's say, like in Switzerland, where they have sort of a mixture of a referendum where each state votes, but there's a tally at the end, and you have to have 50% plus one of the states and 50% plus one of the citizens. We have to find deliberative processes using social media and so on to bring in our citizens on the European issues, make them more participative. So democracy, I think, will also be a big question of how we move forward. Are we going to become something like the United States? Are we going to become something like Switzerland? Or are we going to slowly pull apart again? I would like to see a strong Europe moving forward, more democratic, dealing with these issues, because I think in our world today, only through cooperation can we deal with the major challenges we have. Otherwise, we'll be prey to the whims of our fate, of fate, whatever it might be, and there'll be very major problems we and your generation will face.
One final question?
Sure. Hi, my name is Claire Jasper, and I'm a freshman here at Boston College. I had a question in reference to your time here in America, actually, when you were a child. So how did your time here in America as a child and your education at Amherst affect your role as Prime Minister in Greece?
Good question. I think two things. First of all, having two cultures, sometimes, people sort of, it's difficult, and, if you're a migrant, you don't know where you are and so on. But I think what it also gives you, if you use it constructively, it gives you at least 2 points of view. So I could use my Greek mind on the problem, and then I would use my American mind on the problem. A little bit my Swedish mind too, because I lived in Sweden and Canada too. So a little bit the Canadian mind and the Swedish mind. So it gives you the possibility to look at things from different points of view. Secondly, I think what the U.S. has is an optimism. Now, you may talk to Americans and they'll say, the government, and it's terrible, and we're not doing well, and this, and it's true that the U.S. has gone through a difficult time. But down deep, there's this sort of feeling that, the yes, we can feeling, we can change the world. Now, that optimism doesn't always exist around all the parts of all of our planet. Some people just sort of are there feeling that their fate has already been sealed. So I think the fact of saying, you can make things change. I remember very often in government, I would talk to the bureaucracy. Now, that's maybe not just the Greek bureaucracy, maybe other bureaucracies too. And I would make a suggestion, and then they would immediately say, Mr. Prime Minister, you can't do that. We don't do that in Greece. Other countries might do it, but we can't do this in Greece. And I said, I'm sorry. I don't want you to tell me we can't do it. I want you to tell me how we will do it. So that is a very different type of mentality. And of course, just the fact that living in a more multicultural climate, I think, is always important in a globalizing world, knowing that there are different views, different points of views, and so even in communicating what Greece is going through and what it's to my counterparts in Europe, if I only had a Greek way of, only the Greek experience, I wouldn't really be able to relate. Now, I can relate. I may disagree with Angela Merkel, but I can relate to what she says. She's telling the German people, I'm here to make sure that, your money is well spent, and I'm going to be tough and making sure that, you don't lose your money to these southern countries. I don't agree with that, the way she says it, but I can understand it. I can understand why she's saying it. I can understand the psychology of the Germans. So I think that living in other countries and living in the United States, with very multicultural, is of course, was important. So I hope that gives you some answer of what I learned from my experience in the U.S.
I should clarify something I said earlier. We don't actually own 3 Greek banks. We have a small investment firm in Boston, and we own a little stock in 3 Greek banks. But the sentiment is Greece's on his way to recovery. There aren't many democracies that are new democracies that could suffer a 25% decline in GDP and see those institutions survive. Greece did, and it's a great story. Mr. Prime Minister, would you please accept this as a token of our enthusiasm for what's happening in Greece and what you started?
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for your support. Thank you very much. Thank you.